Good afternoon and welcome to Bridge to India's webinar on Open Access Renewables. This webinar is a part of our series on renewable power use by commercial and industrial consumers in India. Hello, I'm Sangeeta Suresh from Bridge to India, and I would like to thank you all for joining us today. I would like to introduce our speakers and panelists for the day. We have the pleasure of having with us Mr. Dinesh Jagdale, Joint Secretary, MNRE. He will be delivering the keynote address, and he will also be taking questions from the industry regarding open access power. We are also very happy to welcome Ms. Bhavna Prasad, Director of Sustainable Business at WWF India. She will be introducing the READY initiative, which is a strategic partner to our webinar. READY initiative is jointly run by WWF and CNI and is aimed at enabling access to RE power by CNI consumers. Thank you, Bhavna, for joining us today. Our panelist today represents the entire spectrum of players in the open access market. Bringing in the views of developers in the open access market, both wind and solar are Continuum, CleanMax, and Radiance Renewables. We have LONGi and GoodWe representing the component suppliers, and here to speak about the consumer perspective are two CNI consumers, Aditya Prilla and AB InBev. Finally, touching upon the legal aspects of procuring open access power is Trilegal. Thank you all for being a part of this webinar. We really appreciate you setting time aside for us here today. I would like to mention a special word of thanks to our sponsors, Tata Power, LONGi, and GoodWe for supporting our webinar initiatives and enabling us to bring quality content to our participants. Now, on to the agenda for the day. So we will begin today with a brief introduction to India's open access market by Vinay Rustagi, Managing Director of Bridge to India, followed by a brief introduction of the READY initiative by Bhavna Prasad from WWF. We will then have a keynote address by Mr. Jagdale from MNRE, followed by a roundtable discussion with our panelists. And this will be moderated by Vinay. We will have a Q&A session after the panel discussion, but participants can send in your questions at any time through the text box located at the bottom right corner of your webinar panel. If your question is directed at any one of the panelists, I request you to please highlight who they are, since our panel is quite large and it will be great to sort of streamline our session effectively. I would like to also finally mention that any questions that we will not be able to take right now, we will answer you later. So please feel free to write to us at contact@bridge2india. Now I hand the session over to Vinay Rustagi. Vinay, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Sangeeta, and very good afternoon, morning or evening, depending on where you are, to all, everybody who's present on the webinar. We've got a fantastic session lined up, and I just want to lay the scene. Of course, you're here to listen to the various panelists with all their experience and day-to-day observations of the market. But the way we see it, we've been doing a lot of work in the CNI renewable space. This is an extremely active and thriving market. There is a lot of pull from the consumers. There's a lot of investment capital and expertise from the supply side. And like I was mentioning to some of our panelists before the session started, it really does seem like, to use the Hindi phrase, Dula Dulan Raji, tu kya karega kaji, and the reason I say that is because the bride, which is the customer, and the groom, which is the supplier, they are ready, but still, I think the market is in a bit of a balance and not growing as rapidly as it should. The reason, of course, we all know is that the DISCOMs and the state regulators are to some extent not playing ball. So I think that is a key challenge in the market today. And really, I think it is a shame in many ways because we have a very ambitious and aggressive target for renewables in this country. The government is very, very committed, but the DISCOMs, which are the largest consumers of power, are not keen on buying more power because of demand side and other issues. CNI consumers who want to buy more power are actually being stopped in some ways. So I think it is very imperative that the government finds a way for the open access market and the entire CNI renewable market to thrive for the growth of the industry. Within the C&I renewable market, I think open access has a very, very important role to play. Reason, of course, is that rooftop solar, while with all its advantages, has some limitations because it is constrained by space. We don't see many of the alternate business models and products like the virtual PPAs and the green power from the discoms so actively used in India. There are various attempts being made by consumers and DFIs and think tanks, etc., to try and test out some of these new products. But suffice it to say that most of the action today, any consumer who wants to go beyond 10 to 15% of renewable power penetration, today the main option is open access wind and solar. Now, in terms of the discussion today, the key themes for us are one, what is the consumer perspective? What are the consumers looking for? What are their demands from renewable energy suppliers? Of course, policy and regulatory framework is the main subject, and I'm sure that all of us will have lots of points to make and our own experiences to share with the audience. I think technology and financing are two very important dimensions of what is happening, really because with constant improvements in technology, renewables are becoming more attractive, LCOE is coming down, so we'll touch upon these areas. And then finally, financing, in terms of what is the financing landscape. Particularly, I would say more on debt financing and how are the debt financing providers looking at this market and what are their concerns. And finally, we'll try to get a sense of, notwithstanding where the market is today, what can we expect in terms of the future growth? So that is an answer that I would, hope that together with all our panelists, we can come up to like a collective answer that we can kind of agree to. So before I go to the panelists, just very quickly to set the context, C&I consumers today, the direct share of renewable power is only about 5% or less. Bulk of the power that is consumed by them comes from discoms and captive conventional sources. So this 5% share is bound to grow in the coming years. As we can see on this chart on the right, open access occupies bulk of the share of this 5% renewable market. Rooftop solar is continuing to grow, obviously, but then wind and solar and some of the hybrid technologies, etc., have a very important role to play in this. I mentioned about how the C&I consumers are very keen to reduce their carbon emissions under pressure from the investors as well as from the customer base. But of course, the other main reason is that open access or all renewable power indeed is cheaper than grid power, particularly the way grid tariffs for C&I consumers are determined in India. And as you can see from this slide, we've basically shown grid tariffs for industrial and commercial consumers in these two vertical bars in comparison to the cost of open access power landed cost at their premises from captive sources, captive or group captive sources. So as you can see, open access power is cheaper than grid power in most of the states. And that, of course, is one of the major reasons why C&I consumers want to adopt this solution. Finally, just to kind of again lay the context for the, provide some context to the rest of the discussion, we've just laid down how solar, wind, rooftop solar, and open access solar have been growing over the last 5 years. We don't have data, unfortunately, breakup for open access wind, but my understanding is that open access wind on an annual basis is about 200 to 300 megawatts. But I think what is apparent from this slide and what is striking from this slide is that the whole market was growing at 70 to 100% CAGR up until 2 years ago, and since then we have been basically we've started to stagnate, and the volumes have actually shrunk in the last 2 years. And I think this is where the government needs to see the opportunity for open access power, but in particular, and needs to support it. So with that, I will now pass over to Bhavna. Bhavna will give you a quick introduction to the READY program and what WWF and CII are trying to do to encourage the growth of this market. Bhavna, over to you.
Thanks, Vinay and Bridge to India team for inviting WWF to this webinar on open access renewables. Good afternoon to all of you. Actually, before I begin, I wanted to reiterate how critical renewables are in mitigating climate change. The industry has been calling for the current pandemic a black swan event. But if we continue to ignore climate science, we're pretty much heading for greater future shocks. So therefore, renewables are important not just to address climate change, but for India to achieve its ambitious RE targets and also for economic growth and recovery. As Vinay already mentioned, C&I consumers constitute 50% of India's electricity consumption, but actual RE uptake is as low as 5%. Clearly, there's a big gap in this overall consumption and actual uptake of RE. And in order to understand this market segment, we set out to undertake some research and understand. And as part of that research, we found that almost 70% of top 100 companies on the National Stock Exchange were already foraying into renewables and setting targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and making RE commitments. We also conducted in-depth surveys of C&I consumers and found that while many companies have already been making these commitments, they were facing various challenges. Next slide, please. So we found that many of the companies were facing various barriers. For example, 50% cited policy and regulatory barriers in procuring RE, policy inconsistencies between states and at central level, policy uncertainty with frequent policy changes, or yearly changes in additional cross-subsidy surcharge, additional surcharge, or gaps in policy implementation itself. They also highlighted other issues like infrastructure and financing. So in order to address some of these barriers, we felt that in order to work at a transformational level, we really needed to work at a sectoral level, at C&I as a consumer base. So we joined hands with CII in order to kickstart the program called REDE, which is REDE, Renewable Energy Demand Enhancement, to build an alliance among corporate buyers to increase uptake of renewables and also to catalyze solutions to address some of the challenges I just mentioned. We currently have about 22 members. They constitute about 14 gigawatts of electricity demand. And as part of REDE buyers principles, if you go to the next slide, as part of the REDE buyers principles, the companies are keen to increase uptake of RE, but they require long-term policy and regulatory stability to increase this favorable environment, to create a favorable environment. They're looking for greater choice of RE procurement. So open access, of course, being an important part of that solution, but also looking at other alternative options through discoms or other options I will just highlight in my next slide. So lower firm power, they're looking for capacity building to increase RE uptake. So and as it's all right, go to the next slide. So as part of that effort, we have also been exploring alternative corporate RE procurement models, in addition to the current ones that are already available. And we looked at some of the global markets and what were the kind of models that were available and seeing whether they were relevant from an India context or not. For example, green tariffs, where RE can be procured by corporates directly from the discoms. Looking at virtual power purchase agreements, international RECs, and dedicated RE exchanges. We found that corporate PPAs were an important element globally, and so were green tariffs or RECs, which were being explored internationally. So we have been in discussion both with MNRE and also with the corporates and also some of the discoms to see if we can find a way in which we can work together to address some of the challenges, and we are very positive to hear from MNRE on some of the challenges that they are willing to address. and we assume and we are hoping that there will be more uptake and positive growth in the market with some of these barriers and some of these solutions addressed and explored overall. Thank you, Vinay.
Thank you, Bhavna. That's very useful. So let's start the panel discussion. And what I propose to do is I propose to go to the various panelists in turn. But please, the floor is open to everybody. In case you have any points, please raise your hands and feel free to interject at any point of time. We want to keep it as interactive as possible. So, I will start with you, Debasish. Hindalco is a very large consumer of power, and power is not only one of your major costs, but you also need reliability, and you need low-cost power to kind of stay competitive. So, just please walk us through the various power procurement options that you've been looking at. To what extent is renewables a part of that, and within that, how are you going about procuring open access power? So just give us a framework of different options and the way you are analyzing and comparing these options. It will be very useful to hear that.
Yeah, so thanks, Vinay, and I thank Bridge to India team for organizing this event. So before we get into the subject, just very quick background. So Hindalco operates in entire value chain in the aluminum manufacturing, right from bauxite mining, alumina refining, aluminum smelting, and the downstream operations, which includes rolled products, extrusion, and foils. We also have a copper plant in Gujarat. So we have 13 operating units operating out of 8 states. So as many of you may be aware that aluminum production is very energy intensive. Major process energy used is electricity, as smelting is basically an electrolysis process. So our installed capacity of thermal power plant is about 3346 megawatt, that is close to about 3,400 megawatts, of which 340 megawatts is cogeneration units. Of course, these are all thermal cogens. So, and we also have these captive coal mine. So one of the thing is that like many manufacturing process and also for aluminum mostly, we need steady and reliable power. And outage of even 3 hours can freeze the smelter pots, and restarting and stabilization of pots requires about 6 to 12 months. So, so this is a major challenge for us. So we have been complying to our RPU requirements. During last 3 years, have purchased about 45 lakh renewable energy certificates and spent over rupees 500 crores. So this is just to show the commitment of Hindalco towards greening of the environment. So we have well-defined approach towards energy efficiency and carbon footprint reduction. But today we will mostly restrict our discussions to renewable energy. Now, if we come see the what are the options which are available to us in terms of the power mix, we have our own thermal CPPs. We have discom powers mostly for mostly our downstream small units and some refineries. So we also have options of getting exchange power. It could be both renewables and conventional power. We can have bilateral contracts, again, both renewable and your conventional power. And we can have renewable projects, which could be either on-site or off-site projects. Yeah, so using renewables, the biggest challenge, as it is infirm nature, we need 24/7 power. So our process cannot tolerate even excursions beyond 5%, and there are technical challenges, thus limiting the renewable capacity. To overcome this constraint, we are also actively working on few renewable with storage projects, which I shall share in my subsequent discussion. However, as you know that it is still not economically viable, that is the storage option, but we are still exploring some of the options. So I shall again mostly concentrate on the off-site projects and the open access power, but nevertheless we have so far installed about 45 megawatts of on-site solar projects and another 60 megawatt is in the pipeline to be commissioned in next 6 to 12 months. However, there are various challenges with respect to statutory approvals. mostly on land and connectivity approval, primarily reason being unclarity in the state policy and regulations. Most states have policy and regulations for rooftop projects up to 1 megawatt. Above 1 megawatt and behind the consumer meter projects are not covered under these policies or regulations. Some of the states where we are facing a major difficulty are in the states of Maharashtra and Karnataka. Coming to offsite projects, we currently have a hydro project in Maharashtra, and we are utilizing the power under open access in our Taloja plant, which is again in Maharashtra. We have also finalized one offsite solar project for our Taloja unit. Again, power will be consumed under open access. We have been evaluating, feasibility of setting up a large project like in the range of 100 to 200 megawatt solar cum wind project in some of the RE-rich states like Rajasthan or Gujarat, and taking power to some of our units where we operate like Odisha, UP, Gujarat, MP, and Maharashtra. Starting with a power cost of 2 rupee 50 paise at Rajasthan, the landed cost of power at our unit, it becomes 4 rupee 30 to 7 rupee 60 paise, primarily because of various charges, the ISTS charges and the additional surcharge and cross subsidy, all of these. Yeah, so we have been also evaluating a 200 megawatt renewable with storage pumped hydro project to be set up in Andhra Pradesh or in Madhya Pradesh and to be used in our Odisha unit, but it's absolutely unviable financially, primarily because of the high ISTS charges. Of course, there is a new Ministry of Power guideline which has been issued on 5th of August this year on waiver of ISTS charges even for private entities, but this is yet to be adopted by CRC. We are again currently in advanced stage of feasibility and finalization of a 20 megawatt renewable hybrid project for RTC power with storage, which will be having a storage facility in Gujarat. So if you see now in Gujarat, there is a renewable hybrid policy which is there, encourages storage options, but do not cover the same in the policy. So there are a number of uncertainties in terms of interconnectivity between the RE types, capacity limit of each type, transmission capacity allocation, because the consideration for project based on storage are completely different. Also, there are issues with respect to capacity limit of 50% of the contract demand and the issue of captive and group captive. Coming to the state transmission and wheeling charges, what are our experience? It is absolutely very high.
Debasish, I'm sorry if I can just stop you there. We'll come to the state transmission charges a little bit later. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. No, that's very interesting, and we will come back to some of these themes later in the discussion. Before we do that, let me just come over to you, Ashwin. I know AB InBev has adopted, pretty aggressive targets worldwide to increase the adoption of renewables. Can you just give us a status of, what is happening in the Indian business and what are the challenges that you are facing? And in particular, if you can give us a flavor of how does the scenario vary from state to state in procurement of renewable power? That would be very useful to hear.
Sure. Thank you, Vinay. So AB InBev globally, we have a sustainability goal of achieving 100% RE by 2025. We started off full-fledged, like the goals were launched in 2018. In certain countries, in certain continents, we had been working from before itself on achieving RE. So right now we're at a stage where globally we have crossed 50% of our total electricity needs coming through renewable means. In fact, the good news is that there are many countries in North America, Europe, and also Latin America and Africa, in fact, where we have reached almost 100% for all our power needs. So that was probably a few success stories and examples from which we are also trying to learn here in India, trying to replicate and trying to see both internally and also externally in the regulatory landscape what can be done to probably help us reach that figure even quicker in India. In India, if you look at where we are right now, so we did our first offsite PPA in Karnataka for a brewery we have very close to Mysore. And we have in fact reached 65% plus of our electricity needs coming through renewable means in that location. And after that, there has been one site in Maharashtra where we have gone on site with the solar panels, and right now we have 4 more lined up for on-site solar panel installation, like a mix of rooftop and on the land installation. If I look at the overall challenges, considering that we are present in different ways in around 10 states, I would say on-site storage related issues would be one larger technical aspect that we would need to look at, and we need to find a more feasible solution for it, especially with fluctuations and with wind being available for certain time, solar being available for certain time. How can storage be utilized even more for it? I would say that would be one point. Group captive, again, a certain model which we have been exploring a lot in different states. The policy overall is very progressive. There is no doubt about it. I think somewhere the dissonance and the difference in interpretation between what the policy overall intends to achieve and how certain states are interpreting it is something that will need to be addressed. And the good part, again, the flip side or the good part to this is that not every state is interpreting it in the same way. So then there end up being certain states who are being progressive in their own ways. But I guess that probably gives us an opportunity as this larger ecosystem to think about how we can all get together, because we also see that difference in understanding between probably the discoms and the state regulators and the CNI consumers. I think that merger of thoughts and sharing of ideas can definitely be done more, because ultimately this is going to benefit everyone. And if not, then we need to see how, but that conversation needs to happen. So that would probably be one challenge and one potential ways to address it. And then we are looking at a clear path probably ahead of potential for VPPA. Let's see how that develops. REC for us is the final option right now. So the way we are looking at it, we are trying to utilize all of the available on-site, off-site solar wind options, or be it even a group captive multi-party model, utilize that and see where we can get to at max. So yeah, overall that's where we are. And probably one challenge which would become even more pertinent now would be with volume suddenly fluctuating with COVID and lockdown, and us, when we look at the group captive model, there is a particularly defined volume variation which cannot go beyond 10 to 15, and even in the new proposed I think policy change, it will reach probably 30%. So I have noticed that being a certain inhibiting factors for certain corporates who have very high potential changes in volumes across the year or possibility of fluctuation. So that is probably one thing that we can look at. Yeah. So that would be it as a summary from my side.
Thanks, Ashwin. We will come back to you later on some of these issues. Tejas, let me just bring you in. CleanMax is one of the very active players present across rooftop solar, open access, and now even open access wind. Where do you see the demand coming from? Which states, which sectors, in terms of whether it is metals, automotives, etc. And I think we would really like to kind of go deep down into different states and just get your perspective on what are the various challenges that you are facing in setting up open access projects in different states.
Yeah, thanks, Vinay. Just to give you background about CleanMax, we are now operating about 350 megawatts on the farm side and about 100 plus megawatts on the rooftop. We started as a rooftop company. Now we are into solar farms and even wind also. So we are giving round the clock so-called power to the consumers. So as you rightly said, we are now operating across India, whether it is rooftop or wind or solar farms, depending on what we can cater to the customer demand there. So in Karnataka, we are doing wind and solar together. So we are able to offset about 90-91% of the customer's power requirement using this wind and solar technology or the hybrid technology. So as you, the challenges what you are asking on the different states are very different. But if you put all of them, 2-3 points are: one is the banking policy. Across India, probably we have this problem where we don't have clarity. Take it Gujarat or take it Maharashtra or Karnataka. For example, in Karnataka, till date, we were allowed to use the banking facility up to 6 months. Now, suddenly the regulation is saying it is 15 minutes or monthly. So that is still in the discussion. Coming to Gujarat, as Mr. Debasish was saying, if you are not claiming RPO, whether it is 15-minute settlement or a monthly settlement, even though hybrid policy is out, we still don't know. As per the policy, it is clear that it is like a monthly settlement. But when you go and meet the GRT guys, we don't know. We don't get this correct answer, whether it is 15 minutes or monthly. In Tamil Nadu, banking is not there. In Maharashtra, they are saying it is a 15-minute settlement for wind, but you can do a monthly banking for solar. In Andhra and Telangana, it's almost like a no-go. Even if the policy is there or not, you will not be able to get the funding. I mean, that is one of the states where we have a lot of issues which we see. Haryana, where you have put up the plant, but we are not able to get the evacuation, right? So even if the evacuation is there, they are not honoring the commitment. That is one of the states where, again, we have a lot of issues. So highlighting all these things, I think the banking is one of the problem across India, most of the states now in the open access. That is one. And the technologies, as Ashwin was saying on the storage, on-site storage is still a little bit tricky. And then it's not cost effective at this point of time. So, I mean, these are the 2-3 things which I would highlight here.
So what would you say, Tejas, are the 3 best states for open access right now?
Depending on the resource, I think it's the Karnataka, Gujarat, and
I'm saying, sorry, mainly purely from a policy perspective.
From the policy perspective, I think still Karnataka is better once the banking policy is clarified. Second would be Gujarat. Again, the RPO or non-RPO or the 15 minutes versus monthly settlement, if it is clear, at least that is one state where hybrid policy is out and then people are talking about it and we have very good consumer base. So wind and solar both can work together. I think these are the 2 states where you can actively work. Third is Maharashtra. I would say there is a lot of customer requirement there. Hello?
Yes, Tejas, we can hear you. Tejas, we can hear you. I think we lost Tejas. Arvind, can you hear me?
Yes, Vinay, I can hear you.
Okay, so fine. We'll come to you. You heard what Debasish, Ashwin, and Tejas had to say on the policy framework in different states, challenges, consumer requirements, etc. Give us a flavor of what Continuum has been doing. It's not known to many people that Continuum is one of the biggest players in open access project development. Second, while wind is languishing behind solar on the utility scale project side, but I think in open access, we do see some very interesting opportunities for wind. Just talk about that in terms of how wind can supplement with solar and help. And third, just touch upon the policy aspects also, in terms of what is your experience.
Thank you, Vinay. So it was my music to my ears to hear Debasish and Ashwin talk about their commitment to renewables, and I wish more and more corporates follow the paths that you are, and we are able to take part in that journey. At Continuum, we've been selling open access wind since 2012. We today sell about 110 crore units a year from small hydro, from wind and wind solar hybrid. So about 15 crore units out of this 110 crore units is sold with banking. Rest of all the supply is sold through, without utilizing the banking facilities. We are currently generating in Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, and Himachal Pradesh. We have about 110 odd customers to whom we have been supplying this energy. From the hydro project, we supply RTC power with about, on a pre-scheduled 15-minute schedule basis, with about 92% plant load factor on an annual basis. From the wind and solar hybrid, we operate a 227 megawatt wind solar hybrid project in Tamil Nadu, which to our knowledge is the largest operating wind solar hybrid in the country. And the next stage for that project is to add storage sometime planned for second half of next year. We believe that a wind project can do with much less storage requirement than a solar project, and a wind solar hybrid can do even less with even less storage requirement. We believe that wind or wind solar hybrid is ideally suited for the industrial consumers. The rooftop solar is clearly suited for some 5 to 10% of requirements of industrial consumers, more suited for commercial consumers. In our view, solar is the best place for commercial consumers, which are essentially day consumers. But our focus has been to sell to the industrial consumers, where our realization is that from a consumer's perspective, the scarce commodity is a connected load to the grid. So if a consumer has 10 megawatt connected load, they can only buy 10 megawatt of open access. And therefore, they need to maximize the amount of energy they can buy on open access, which means it translates into plant load factor. And on one hand, and second, consumers pay higher tariff during the morning and evening peak hours. So to the extent consumers can get a higher percentage of supply during those peak hours, their savings are higher even at the same cost per unit. So our relationship with the consumers is based on the annual savings that consumers make by buying from us, which we believe goes to, from a wind standalone project, it's about 2x that of a solar standalone project, and a wind solar hybrid takes it to 3 times the annual savings that a solar project can provide to a consumer for a given connected load. We think so. We currently operate only in these 3 states. However, the project that we have in Himachal Pradesh, on the hydro side, we sell that energy on interstate basis to consumers in Delhi, 24/7 consumers in Delhi. The remaining power in Tamil Nadu and Gujarat, it's all sold on interstate basis to consumers in Tamil Nadu and Gujarat. We have experience only of these 4 states as of now. Some little experience of selling in Orissa, which I think is an attractive market from a CNI perspective. We've just started selling some energy to some esteemed consumers in Orissa just in the last 2 or 3 months. So we think that is an interesting market to explore going forward. On the regulatory side, I believe that open access market will always remain sensitive because the DISCOMs want to retain their consumers, and the equilibrium point will be reached where the DISCOMs make the same profit per unit of open access as they make by selling the same electricity to their consumers. In some states, we believe that equation has reached, and therefore the regulatory situation is more stable. Where it is not, we believe it will remain a tug of war, or it will take some more time to reach there. As of now, we believe these 3-4 states that we are working in, we believe it's a sustainable business plan and business model that you can work in these states. There are some challenges in other things.
Sorry, Arvind, which are those 3 or 4 states?
So we are currently operating in Gujarat, Tamil Nadu. We sell in Delhi and Orissa.
Yeah, okay.
We think Maharashtra is getting there. We'll soon get there. It's not ideally there right now, but we'll soon get there. Rajasthan, there are some policy interpretation issues, which will take their own time through the legal system, but over the next 12 to 18 months, we see those getting sorted out, and it will be an attractive market. MP is an attractive market. However, economics are slightly more challenging compared to other states because the MP DISCOM is trying very hard to retain its consumers. But if you have an efficient project, and our philosophy is in any market that we build, we should have the most efficient project from a customer's perspective. Then even if you have a regulatory ding-dong, you will figure out a way to make and exceed your cost of capital and your returns as a generator and provide enhanced value to the customer. So we don't believe in, as a company, we don't involve ourselves in lobbying or for regulations. We just take the regulations as is, make our own analysis as to where the regulations will go. And if we have a workable business model in that regulations, we go and participate. and create a win-win solution for ourselves and our customers.
Sure. Arvind, interestingly, while CleanMax is moving from solar to wind, you are moving from, you're coming from the opposite direction and trying to hybridize your wind projects by adding more solar capacity at the same places. So just, talk us through your experience in that regard. How easy or difficult is it to convert wind projects into hybrid projects, mainly from land availability point of view, any other operational, technical, or legal policy-related issues?
Yes, so we think the hybridization of existing wind farms is the most attractive opportunity in the open access space because you can utilize the existing infrastructure and provide an enhanced value to your customers. However, there are a few requirements to be able to get there. One is we believe you need to have 100% ownership of the wind farm. You need to have dedicated evacuation infrastructure because when you hybridize, you need to operate the two plants in conjunction. And you can't operate two plants in conjunction if you don't fully own both of them. So at Continuum, we have, from day one, we've chosen that approach. We build our own farms, we develop them on our own, and we only build where we can own 100% of the wind farm and we can have a high voltage connection to a 400 kV grid. Absent these, we don't build a project. So we have about 800 megawatts of capacity, which is ready and live, where we would add solar and storage hybrid over the next 2 years.
Okay, and in terms of, sorry, I was just, sorry, I'll just come back to you, Arvind, later on. Let me move to Manikkan. Manikkan, you've heard what Debasish and Ashwin had to say, and also Arvind and Tejas. So, you are, like we discussed, you're one of the newest developers with some very formidable institutional and equity backing. What is the kind of opportunity that you see in the open access space? The second thing, if you can, offer us your comments on is, the developers ideally want a long-term PPA with a long-term lock-in. But the consumers are not keen to offer that. I mean, they obviously want to minimize that. So how does that kind of friction playing out in the marketplace? What are the typical terms on the PPAs being signed today? Manikkan, over to you.
Vinay. Thank you, Vinay. Thanks to the Bridge to India team for inviting me. It was great to hear from Debasish and Ashwin and everyone else, including my contemporaries who are developers in the industry and have much longer experience than I have. But nevertheless, I would say that this is definitely a very interesting space. I think the market is exploding. The one thing we see as a trend is that because of the current COVID situation, it is only going to accelerate the growth of OPEX-based models, the model that we are focusing on at Radiance. Our vision is to develop a 1.5 gigawatt platform over the next 3 to 4 years' time, which is a combination of both rooftop projects as well as open access projects. So the interesting thing we see in the open access space is that the tug of war that exists between the DISCOM and the developers is going to continue. And as rightly pointed out by Arvind, we do not rely on necessarily lobbying with the regulators or DISCOMs because they will follow their own journey. But having said that, one has to make an investment in this space in a very judicious manner. And there are states which are good for doing open access business, and there are states which are getting to that point from a maturity perspective. So they will reach that point over time. Like Rajasthan is a market which is an interesting market because it has got good radiation, has some good, interesting customer base. But at the same time, they are going through a flux in terms of the sort of policy changes. We are seeing increasing pressure coming in from the regulators and DISCOMs in the traditional states like Karnataka, which has now moving towards sort of monthly banking under the new proposal that they have submitted, which is still under draft discussion. And the funny thing was that they not only putting it into a monthly banking, but even saying that if there is any excess power left into the grid, that will be settled at 0 rupees, which is not being, which we are not seen in any other state. So I think on one hand, people have been looking at this group captive and captive as a model, and increasingly group captive itself is coming under some form of a threat, where in Maharashtra we have seen that group captive as a concept itself attracts additional surcharge of 1.3 rupees, and that puts the whole economics under question mark. And then in other states like Karnataka, what I hear unofficially on the ground is that they don't mind allowing sort of captive in a group captive format, but companies from the same group, not across sort of different entities. That's the latest on the ground. And in Tamil Nadu, again, they want to restrict it to 2 or 3 sort of entities per group, unless you are from the same group. So these are all changes, and none of this you will find as hard code or written anywhere. For example, even if you see rooftop regulations permit you to do net metering in Tamil Nadu, but you try to do that for HT customer, you will find that net metering is not possible, and there is nowhere it is written that it is not possible, but it is the practice on the ground. So the hierarchy of regulations that are followed because of the sort of concurrent nature of the electricity being a concurrent subject. There are laws which are central in nature, there are laws which are state, and then there are laws in each state that undergo changes. So it's a very dynamic field. You need to keep track of all these changes, and especially for a customer, I find that of course people like Debasish and Ashwin, they are very educated. They track this for a long time. They are aware of it, but there are a lot of customers who get very confused, and then there are developers who try to pull a fast one and try to promise things which don't happen, really speaking. So those are the challenges that we see on the regulatory space. And even as recently in Karnataka, even for open access projects that have been operating since 2018 under the 2018 regime, even there today, some of the customers who used to buy power from developers and also buying power from the exchange, they used to buy the power by getting an NOC every month from the exchange, from the SLDC, and that was submitted to the exchange, and they could buy power to meet their requirements. Even they have been now questioned as to why do you need an NOC when you're already buying power from, say, solar or wind, for that matter, because the capacity that you have contracted under the contract demand is already exceeding based on what you're buying from the open access existing projects that you have contracted with. So those are the kind of challenges. But from in energy terms, they are not able to meet the energy requirements. Even if you are part of an RE100 company or you want to meet 100% of your requirement, the difficulty is that you cannot actually get it done on the ground. These are the challenges. These are more policy driven and interpretation driven. I think the issues in Karnataka is today because they have reached 85% of their power requirements through renewable sources in certain months of the year. So obviously, when that situation happens and the REC targets have been met for them, they put a little bit more pressure on the market. But I think again, this is a very bad year to take that example because the demand has suddenly slowed down in the industry. And if you take 3 years down the road, again, you might find that that situation doesn't exist anymore. So this has to be taken more from a longer term perspective rather than sort of a start and stop approach. But having said that, I would still say that markets like Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, from a solar power developer, Gujarat, they're all good markets. Maharashtra, as I agree with Arvind, it is a market that is opening up. Again, having challenges on additional surcharge interpretation and how they're levying it. So those are all challenges that we are seeing. Coming to the second part of your question, which is to do with PPAs and long-term PPA and lock-in periods. This has become an interesting point for discussion in the recent months, especially when customers are sort of confused as to what is going to be their long-term stable demand, because they've had a start-stop situation of the factories since April the lockdown began. Some of them are operating full-time, sometimes some of them operating in 50%. So their consumption patterns have changed, and they are also a little worried about their future in terms of the consumption of their of power for their own requirements. And therefore, the question that comes up is, should I enter into a long-term PPA or should I look at a short-term PPA and or have a shorter sort of lock-in periods? The difficulty with that approach is that, and on top of it, they don't want to do capex because capex is a no-no now. Everybody wants to do opex. The moment you move to that model and you want to do a very short-term lock-in or a short-term PPA, the banks do not finance it. The banks and lending institutions are not used to a short-term lock-in periods. because they don't have any basis to forecast the tail period of the life of the asset. So there is no way they would do it. If you do a 10-year lock-in, they would finance it on an 8-year basis. If you do a 15-year lock-in, they will finance it on a 13 or 14 or 15-year basis. So that changes the whole economic model for the customer, because they want an immediate saving, and that saving would not be available if you do shorter-term PPA. So the only way to address that shorter-term PPA and shorter-term lock-in models is that we got to move to a very different model. Like we see that in the UK and in Australia and other markets, you have to move towards a more sort of CFD models, contract for difference models. Right now, that's not allowed in the Indian context under the law. So I think maybe our colleagues, Amar, probably can throw some more light on that in the discussion. But that could be an interesting model. So you can actually segregate the buying of power from meeting your green attribute requirements. The second thing is, even if you see from a green attribute perspective, today all RECs have to be sold through the exchange. There cannot be any bilateral sale of RECs that can happen, which again is a limitation, because if I want to sign up with a customer who wants bilaterally for me to give him the RE benefits, we cannot do that. Even though it may not be called an REC, it can be called as a green attribute. There is no model available, or at least I'm not aware of the model that is available in which this can be done domestically. It is being done now through an offshore mechanism, through an IREC mechanism, but it could be done in a domestic model. But there is nothing that stops us from looking at it from a domestic model. So those are because then you could price that, you could give banks the assurance that that is another way I'm going to get revenue. All that models don't exist right now. But those are the kind of things you should see more changes coming through, and I'm confident that this will happen as the industry matures. And I also believe that as developers come together, they need to sort of be more persuasive with the regulators, as not to keep changing the policies. Have more stable policy, follow it up with whatever you have decided at state levels, and do not keep changing it every 3, 4, 5 years based on what your current requirements are. That is not very healthy from a long-term investment perspective, both for equity investors and for lenders. Those are my sort of initial comments.
Thanks, Manikkan. Arvind, you have something interesting to say on lock-in versus debt financing, reacting to Manikkan's comments?
Yes, Vinay. So I think our own experience is that lock-ins are not very critical if the project is economically competitive and can prove itself to be sustainability competitive. So we have 17, 18-year financings on our CNI projects on a project finance basis, with PPA lives are 12 to 15 years, but lock-ins are 1 to 3 years. So we have to demonstrate that our project will remain ahead of the competition in the market. We have the ability to continue to add value to the consumer through hybridization, through upgrade of technologies in the existing wind farms, or through adding storage. So as long as we demonstrate it, I think the lenders buying, we have funded almost 1,400 crores of debt on that basis on our existing projects from domestic markets. But I think remaining competitive is the key, and I think to some extent, we have probably fixated with this contracted life of PPAs, because if you see, bulk of the bank lending happens without long-term contracts, whether it is to a steel industry or a car manufacturer or a leather goods manufacturer or garments manufacturer or what have you. The lending happens on competitive dynamics and the ability of the project or the business model to sustain itself. So if we remove the fixation of long-term contracts, we believe we are just falling into the groove of natural lending to which lenders are most used to. And we need to then move the needle a bit to project financing, which we have been able to do in all of our projects.
Okay, thanks, Arvind. So let us slightly change tack and talk technology now, and come to Arijit and Vivek in turn. So Arijit and Vivek, I mean, the question really is that, in particular, both solar and wind technologies are changing so dramatically. There are so many innovations in technology, efficiency is getting better, cost is coming down, etc. And of course, the impact is that the renewable power reliability is improving, LCO is coming down. So Arijit, if I can just start with you, if you can talk us through what are some of the changes in module technologies. In particular, how does it kind of play into the growth of the open access renewables market, and to what extent is LONGi targeting the open access or the CNI renewable market?
Thank you, Vinay. Thank you, Bridge to India, for this platform. I think this discussion is really interesting, and particularly we are not very. I think me and Vivek will not be very. We are not expert of this subject, but when it comes to technology, I would rather say, since inception of this industry, we have seen the module technology was actually following the price trend. It was not a technology improvement that was a prime factor which was there in the module business. But since last few years, what we are seeing, the prevalent poly technology where the prices were going down is completely now shifted towards mono-PERC. And if you see this year, the complete market is adopting mono-PERC technology. And in coming days, we're also seeing that the downwards price of module will not continue the way that it was actually happening earlier. Now the market will follow the technology, and the prices will somewhere it will be stabilized. Coming in future, we will see more adaptation of bifacial technology, where in past we have seen the trend of LIDs which are coming down, and LONGi has been pioneer in the design changes, and we have adopted gallium doping, which in rest of the module industry now everyone is adopting. And that these kind of changes, small changes, are basically improving the efficiency of the module, improving the total yield, and then also improving the performance and reliability of the module technology. In coming time, we will see that bifacial technology will actually be more, it will be adapted more and more in this industry, and especially in open access, where I think the albedos can be managed better, and where we have seen that the price delta was very high earlier. Now the price delta is reducing, and the bifacial gain is also increasing. So when it comes to the technology improvement, since beginning we haven't seen any kind of technology improvement which is being adopted. There are a lot of technology improvement happening in the industry, but because of the scalability and the pricing and everything, it was not being adopted widely. Now, since last year, when the whole industry is moving towards mono-PERC, and then we are seeing influx that a lot of bifacial modules inquiries are now coming, where already Europe and American market has already adopted. Japan is doing very well. Australia is doing very well with bifacial. I think India will be the next who will be adopting bifacial, and then accordingly the plant designing and all these things will change shape. So I believe going forward, price will not be a prime factor. Technology will also keep on changing, and with the upgradation of technology, the more and more these upgradations will get adopted in the market. I believe the technologies will also change drastically, since we are seeing that 0.5% increase in efficiency. And now all the module companies, when I am representing the module manufacturer entity here, all the module manufacturing companies are going towards higher watt peak modules. Earlier we have seen it was confined within the 300 bracket. Then LONGi was the company who showed that module can also be produced over 400 watt peak. Now it's going towards 500 and then 600, like that. So I believe these kind of changes are happening, and more the consumers, they will adapt technology. Maybe the scale will also increase and the commercial will also change.
Sure, Arijit. So tell me, is there a difference in the way projects are adopting new technology for open access as against for the vanilla utility scale projects? Is there any difference in your view?
I don't think so, because open access projects, they're more pro to new technologies because they have a room to play, where utility scales have already a long-term planning and they don't have much room to play there to adapt a new technology. They need to plan their projects quite long time, and open access projects, the planning time is much shorter. So it's much easier for them to adapt a new technology. Rather, rooftop customers adopts new technologies much faster than open access, and then the utility scale they actually adopt it.
That's very interesting, Arijit. Thanks. Vivek, I'll come to you now. I think most of the time, when it comes to technology, we hear about the modules industry. What is happening with the different module technologies, like Arijit mentioned, the cost, etc. How is the inverter industry keeping up? And I'm sure that there are a lot of we saw the growth of string inverters some time ago, but there must be changes in inverter technology which are keeping up with the module design and new technologies. Also, now with storage coming in, how does the inverter industry facilitate these changes and meet the needs of the C&I consumers? Vivek, I think you're muted.
So now, perhaps now you can hear me.
Yes.
So
thank you.
yeah, so I think from our side, just to give a very quick and brief introduction, GoodWe is a 15 gigawatt manufacturer of inverters, and we are the world's leading storage battery as well as storage inverter manufacturer. In fact, we are training to most of the European, American, and the Japanese company in the storage segment. And I think this is an interesting area because most of the discussion that was happening today is to do with a different version of how power will be happening. So I think one thing I think all the panelists will agree is that the open access is a quite risky proposition in the long term, because the developers are looking for a long-term PPA, okay, to sign with the end customer, and the end customer is not very sure whether I should indeed go for a long-term PPA or not. Just keep that thought in your mind, because being an international company, I mean, GoodWe being an international company, we have created a product which is now based on international experience, and I will just explain to you how we fit into the new ecosystem of open access, which is there from the technology aspect. I think since open access is suddenly becoming very risky, so the next question that a lot of developers will be thinking is that what is the future of open access? Now, the future of open access is, as per us, should be that the assets should be able to communicate to each other to give power to some big company, for example, Hindalco. Okay, so that is the future of open access that we are seeing. I mean, right now what is happening is that there are pure energy scales where you go to Hindalco and you say, I want to have a 100 megawatt PPA for solar, and that is enough. Okay, but the future is much more complex. The future has many components of so basically, so the future has
Sorry, Vivek, we cannot hear you. Somebody is being muted. Hello, Vivek, can you hear me?
I think, now I can, you can hear me now.
Sorry, yes.
So I think there's a pop-up which came, but anyways, what we are saying is that the open access is expecting a consumer to sign a 10 megawatt or 100 megawatt PPA with you, and based on the international experience that we have, we believe that the market of power will be flexible, and it will be on demand. So what we mean by that is that the consumer wants a flexible source of power, because he does not want to get into a long-term contract by signing, this maybe a wind or a solar or a storage battery, and it has to be on demand. The reason for that on demand is obviously because there are different times of the day. Maybe sometimes the power is expensive, or the other times power is cheaper. Then maybe you need some frequency regulation. So we have to. So I hope that we can perhaps agree that the future of power is going to be certainly based on the two principles of being flexible as well as on demand, which is actually antithetical to the whole concept of a long-term PPA of 100 megawatts or a 200 megawatts that we want the end customer to sign. So now we want to get into the technology aspect of what is happening. GoodWe has developed inverters, batteries, and a monitoring platform which can develop as a virtual power plant, a VPP. Under this virtual power plant, a consumer, a producer of energy can communicate with multiple end consumers through a common grid. Okay, and now what happens is now you become a part of a bigger ecosystem where you may have 10 kilowatt into thousands of decentralized sites, or you may have a 5 megawatt of centralized site. But ultimately, all these inverters should be able to communicate with each other effectively to find out who is the customer who indeed needs power. And I believe that any open access customer today has to think about this future, which is inevitable, as one Mr. Manikkan was saying, that is inevitable in 3 or 4 years. So what is perhaps going to happen is that you need a technology which is integrated with the IoT or the cloud. And the reason for that is you need to communicate what is the ability for you to produce energy. So there has to be some integration with IoT and cloud. And ultimately, this information needs to go to the DISCOM or maybe a virtual power operator or to the end customer. Okay, so that all this information is communicated to them, and we know that which company has what demand, and then based on this demand, we can give this energy to them. And in the international market, we are already doing this in areas like Australia and Netherlands. So for example, maybe you have a 10 megawatt plant, but you need to shut off, let's say, half the plant. How do you do it? I mean, this situation can come. So you need a technology which can switch off certain inverters. Okay, you need a technology which can adjust the power factor. So perhaps tomorrow the government will come up with a policy where they will say that for frequency control, I will pay you maybe 10 rupees per unit. So are you geared towards a technology that may give you that 10 rupees per unit in the future? So that inverter should be able to do both the things, which is adjust the power, the frequency, as well as the ability to communicate with this cloud or grid or VPP that you might imagine is coming. That is doing the flexible operation and the on-demand operation. We have done one project in Germany, and this project we have supplied the technology. GoodWe has supplied the technology, and this is an unsubsidized program, and it is akin to merchant power, where simply a 100 megawatt developer has decided that he does not need a 10-year PPA, and I will just operate as a merchant. If someone needs power, I will supply him power, whether that is DISCOM or the end customer, it does not matter. And if someone wants to do a time of day PPA with me, for example, maybe Hindalco thinks that between 3 to 5 p.m. my load is excess, I can go with the time of day PPA with them. But then again, this inverter will not be a pure inverter. It is a part of the smart grid, the microgrid that we keep on hearing about, which is able to communicate to a bigger ecosystem on the energy demands and making it flexible. Yeah, so I think this is all from our side. And on the storage part, I think on the storage part, I think there's a lot of excitement which is happening in Australia and Europe. And there are practically thousands of decentralized, 10 kilowatt storage plant that almost every house is happening, is installing. It is to do with the time of day tariff, and also to give this excess energy to someone who really needs it more. And it is being managed seamlessly, very nicely by several discoms or even community level software, which is able to create this bridge between the consumer and the person who creates power. Yeah. So I think this is from the side of GoodWe. Thank you.
Yeah. So, thank you, Vivek. Pretty cutting edge stuff, and I'm sure the sector will benefit massively from all these improvements. Let me just come to Amar, to you last but not least, and come back to the legal and the regulatory issues. You've heard the various policy-related challenges being pointed out by the developers as well as the consumers. I think the thing is that the space continues to evolve. There are now amendments proposed to the Electricity Act. There are now changes proposed to the group captive formulation. So can you, it would be very useful for us to hear how you see some of these changing regulations affect the open access market. That is one. And second, some people have already talked about alternate business models, in particular virtual power purchase agreements, etc. From your perspective, how do you see the viability evolving for these new business models? Amar, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Vinay. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. So firstly, thanks Vinay, Sangeeta, and the rest of Bridge to India team for organizing this. It's actually been very interesting to hear the perspective of the different stakeholders in the same industry. Now, before responding to your questions, just a bit of introduction. I'm a partner with Trilegal. We are a full-service law firm. We've actually been involved in the renewable space right from the inception of renewable projects in India and have been closely monitoring the evolution. We advise on the entire spectrum of renewable energy projects, from advising the government while designing a procurement process or a bid. For example, the REVA 1 project, we were advising IFC and the government of Maharashtra, doing the same for REVA 2, the upcoming REVA 2 project. On the private side, we advise a variety of developers on utility scale projects as well as CNI projects. Then, of course, procurers of power on the private side, CNI consumers on signing up to corporate PPAs, and of course the lenders, and a variety of contractors as well in the industry. Now, in responding to your questions, I think now we've seen that there's been a fair bit of policy uncertainty as far as open access solar is concerned. This has been on a variety of accounts, and some of which have really plagued investment or the how investors perceive risk in this sector. I mean, we've already spoken about, I mean, if you were to talk about, say, AP, where you have certain exemptions which are provided, whether it be waiver of CSS, waiver of your transmission and wheeling, and subsequently they come back because of a change in policy or a change in how the banking regime works in certain states, all of which create a lot of issues, both from a procurer perspective, a generator perspective, and also for lenders, sponsors, and also when we talk about the secondary sale market, how investors are perceiving the risks that arises because of this regulatory uncertainty. The other thing, I think I'm probably stepping a bit aside from what you asked me, but just to give my few bits, is that I think the entire regime about open access, to my mind, is fairly inflexible, because what we need is that when we talk about corporate PPAs with CNI consumers, there needs to be a bit of flexibility. For example, under your PPA, you typically see provisions of the nature of suspension, events of default, during which you probably will not be able to supply or supply power to your consumer. What happens then? So let me just give you an example of, in terms of if you have a
Sorry, Amar, when you say that there should be some flexibility, Are you talking about the PPAs or the regulatory framework? The PPAs.
I'm talking about the regulatory framework, because typically, which is why I'm trying to explain that, your PPAs typically have provisions such as suspension of supply of power in case of, say, a payment default or any other event of default subsisting on part of the consumer. So a generator of power would effectively want the ability to have the ability to sell power to on an alternate basis during the interim period, right? So effectively, you would think about selling power on the power exchange in the short term. Now, if you have a long-term access granted to you, then in practice, while you are not restricted from applying for a short-term open access, but the SLDCs often create an issue, and they want some sort of an NOC coming through from your consumer who's your identified consumer as far as your long-term open access is concerned. So from a generator side, that's something you seem to get constricted because of these things. And I'm happy to hear Arvind's views and other developers' views on this, because this is something that we've definitely seen in the industry. Then also the number of, when I talk about inflexibility, in most of the states, the number of changes in a year to your long LTA withdrawal points is restricted to just 2. And this goes back to the entire discussion on the length of your PPAs, your lock-in periods, and things of that nature, right? So how does it sort of affect where we are at in the market, this policy uncertainty? And is that the fact it translates into your PPA discussions, to my mind? So we see very protracted negotiations when it comes to which party sort of bears the risk of the charges on transmission, CSS, all of which seem to be changing fairly often in the market. So from a consumer perspective, as you mentioned in the beginning, Vinay, some of the consumers want to go green from a shareholder investor perspective. Some of them just want to save cost in terms of power procurement. So in the latter category, what a consumer is effectively looking at is some sort of guaranteed minimum savings, so to speak, right? In which case they're effectively trying to put the risk of the policy uncertainty, the rates of your CSS, additional surcharge, transmission, wheeling, all on the generator. And from a generator perspective, that sometimes becomes difficult, although you may have a change in law sort of provision, but a change in law sort of provision works very differently when you're talking about a utility scale project and when you're talking about a CNI PPA. But in terms of evolution, coming back to the question you asked me, look, when we talk about the cross-subsidy surcharge, additional surcharge, the original 2003 Act, or the current law as it stands today, contemplated that all these charges were to be reduced over time, something that we've actually not seen. The onus was on the state commissions to do so. They were to be guided by your tariff policies, which the central government comes out with. But what we've seen is a trend which is to the contrary, actually. We've seen that most of these charges have been going up and up, because largely due to the resistance from the DISCOMs. In India, as opposed to many other countries, the highest consumers of power are required to pay the most. It's obviously with the view to subsidize the agriculturists, given that we are an agriculture-based economy. But what we've seen in terms of the new proposed amendments to the Electricity Act is that the center wants to take this power away from the states, and they want that the charges or the trend of these charges, CSS and other charges of this nature, to be in line with the national tariff policy that the center comes out with, as opposed to the states being guided by the policy. They want the states to follow the policy. So these are the proposed amendments to Section 42 specifically of the Act. Now we are yet to see how this will play out. It also sort of goes against where electricity stands in terms of our constitution, where it is a concurrent lit subject, that is both the center as well as the state have power as far as making law as far as the subject is concerned. So this is sort of centralizing the power in the as far the lawmaking power is concerned in the entire electricity power market. So it's an interesting development, but difficult to see how it's going to play out.
So I think the gist I get, Amar, is that by and large, the changes proposed in the Electricity Act are positive for this market. The central government is trying to streamline some of the more uncertain aspects and the variability that is there from state to state. Having said that, the past experience with the Electricity Act does not actually give so much confidence in the sense that the states, in any case, they go and do something which is not exactly in conformity with the Act. And very rarely do we see, states being hauled up for that. So I think to some extent, I'm still not able to see how, particularly given the opposition of the states to these amendments, what kind of change are we realistically going to see?
Look, it's anyone's guess. There has, as you pointed out, there's been a fair bit of resistance from the states. Look, to my mind, going back to what I just said about the reduction of the CSS, the cross-subsidy surcharge, transmission wheeling charges, etc., all of which are the uncertain factors as far as open access sale is concerned. Even if the center, to my mind, tries to regulate it or tries to bring it in line with the original contemplation under the Electricity Act, where they were to reduce over time, there was priority to be given to renewables, which definitely isn't the case anymore. If you look at Maharashtra, the cross-subsidy surcharge is now at par with conventional sources of power. So there's effectively no preference for renewables, which largely goes against the vision of the current government and the targets that India has signed up to. Look, at the end of the day, utility scale is not going to be the be-all and end-all as far as meeting those targets is concerned. This market definitely needs to pick up. Then. Yeah,
that's fine, Amar. Let me just come back to you later. I think one of the things I want to talk about, and really very happy to throw the floor open to anybody who wants to respond. What is the market practice today on group captive policy? We understand that most projects are being structured on a captive basis to basically minimize the regulatory risk and the burden of charges like CSS, etc. But then again, the various changes are being planned to the captive policy itself. So has the whole market moved to the captive policy? What are the various risks, etc.? And how do the developers, are they happy to cede control and give equity to the investors, to the consumers? And are the consumers happy to take that equity? So it will be useful to hear from both the developers as well as Debasish and Ashwin. Debasish, why don't we start with you?
Go ahead.
So yeah, so if we see again, on the captive and group captive. So this is again my interpretation. If we see the electricity rules 2005, the definition of a captive power plant is absolutely clear. There are two criteria: 26% equity and 51% consumption. So these are the two criteria. But some of the states are making new kind of changes to bring in new definition. So that's the difference. So that we see mostly in states like Maharashtra. We have faced this issue in Maharashtra where they have tried to interpret it in a different way. No, so it is absolutely not gone. We also see this issue. We had a couple of discussions in Gujarat. So we also find that they are also interpreting in this fashion. I am not very sure because we have still not implemented this project in Gujarat. So as we go forward, we can see what's the actual case.
But if I can ask you, the projects that you're working on, which are in the pipeline, are they all structured as captive projects?
Yeah, so we have it is structured as a captive project. So actually, if you see strictly the definition of a group captive, it essentially means one generator and multiple users. So and actually, and that is a very cost-effective way of a project. If you set up a bigger project, the cost is much lower compared to a small project. Okay, so ultimately it is beneficial to the society at large. But there are many obstructions in that respect.
Sure. Ashwin, how does it play for you? Are you comfortable from a corporate perspective making investments into renewable developers and signing into this principle?
Yeah, so very clearly from the perspective of group captive projects having a certain shorter duration also compared to other PPAs that we look at, and also the returns being very good. So most of the group captive, when we do the financial evaluation and when we look at the NPV IRR or the payback time periods, it's honestly not bad. In some cases, in some states, it's very good. So if you look at it from a financial perspective, from a risk abatement perspective, yes, it is quite a good option that way. There are a few challenges which sort of hold us back, and I would say I've seen many others also being held back because of this. And in fact, of late, we had been finding out a lot about this because we wanted to do and we wanted to carry out the group captive approach in 2 different states. A few very clear challenges. One that I already mentioned was around the variation in consumption not being very high, around 10 to 15%. And that's where probably a hybrid model works better, and that's what we need to look at. That would be one. Then there are other cases in certain states of differences in interpretation between the equity consumption ratio. So there has been a case where a corporate with 26% equity was having 100% consumption, and then there ended up being like a lot of to and fro with the regulator and the discom. So probably much more ironclad clarity on that would be helpful. Then the possibility of banking provisions in all states. This is not there right now. It's there in a few states where it's for a month or two. But I think if there is a very clear banking provision which comes along with the group captive option, this will definitely encourage more, because again, the multi-party model, anyway, when you look at the control and equity aspects and the management aspects, they are okay if you are just one party. But the moment there are multiple parties, group captive tends to be a little not that clear on if one party defaults, what are the implications on the others.
Understood. So, but in a sense, what you're saying is that despite the challenges and the interpretation issues, you are signing up to captive structured PPAs and making the necessary investment.
We haven't signed up yet, so we would like to. We have evaluated in a few states. We haven't signed up yet because of these challenges that we very clearly see.
All right. Okay. Interesting. If I can come to Manikkan, Arvind, and Tejus in that order. Manikkan.
Yeah. Hi, Vinay. So the question is more about group captive and captive, right? Is that the question?
Yes.
So basically,
or I would say captive versus a pure third-party PPA, because my understanding is that group captive has basically become captive, with one customer, one developer.
Yeah, that is right. I think originally the model was a third-party open access, which is actually the most flexible model, which would be the preference of the industry as well, because there is no need for the industry to invest if it is not required to invest, right? But because of the cross-subsidy surcharge and additional surcharge and these issues related to this, what has happened is that the captive and group captive model has emerged as a more preferred model to eliminate those regulatory charges, because those are under the Central Act, they cannot be levied. Now the challenges are, like, for example, I don't know how it works for Ashwin, but what we see with a number of MNC customers is that they have a limitation in terms of holding more than 20% equity because of the consolidation issue. So they would prefer to have less than 20 or 19% or whatever. In which case you are forced to get one more customer with 7% equity or something like that as a combination, which has got its own challenges, as Ashwin rightly pointed out. The cross default provisions, if one customer defaults, then the other customer loses his captive status because of that. Then how do you deal with it in that particular year? So those are the challenges that you see in that model. But the captive model is a good model. The other challenge is from a developer perspective is if you are developing a large solar park and you want to give the power to multiple customers, you will have to decide upfront what is the sizing of those parks. If you're doing single captive for a single customer. Second is customers like Hindalco or large customers, they will have multiple facilities even in the same state, which will be 4 or 5 facilities in one state across various rolling units or whatever they are putting up. They would want all of them to be buying power from that particular captive source. Now, under the Electricity Act, each of the meter will be treated as a consumer, and therefore each is a consumer. So in that context, how do you make that group captive work? Then if 5 meters of the same customer are buying power from me, are they captive or group captive? Okay, because the entity investing equity is only one. It is still the same legal entity, but 5 different consumers. This is the fine argument that Maharashtra has used to levy additional surcharge. So these are the unintended consequences of drafting that has creeped in, and people are using it in different ways. These are some of the challenges there. But having said that, captive is a good model to look at in the current scenario.
Thanks, Manikkan. That's pretty interesting insights. Arvind, do you by and large agree with that? Anything interesting to add to that?
So I think we look at all of this flux in the group captive regulations in the context of the fact that historically it's been abused by the industry. So if you look at the amendment proposed in the Electricity Rules 2005, that we believe is in the right direction of making it healthier and transparent. And the spirit of the law, as Amar would probably appreciate, the spirit and letter should synchronize with each other. At the central level, I think the law is intended to be a good law, but it's been in cold storage for the last 2 years, ever since the draft was released, and I wish it sees the light of the day sooner than later. Because if that brings intent and the letter together, then I think at the state level also you'll have far less flux and opposition to it, because that makes it really captive or group captive, whichever way you look at it. And all the efforts that are being made, whether it's at Maharashtra level or Rajasthan or Karnataka, all of them are basically trying to fight the arbitrage that the industry is using without following the spirit of it. The spirit was that consumers should make an investment. They cannot make investment, as Debasish pointed out, at a scale which is required to set up a power plant, but they could come together and make an investment and therefore get the benefit of the charges. If you bypass that, then the regulator is bound to have an issue. Our opinion is that no arbitrage will last forever. You have arbitrage, it will get plugged sooner or later. So these challenges are as long as we exploit these situations.
Sure. Thanks, Arvind. Tejas, anything to add to that? Any more nuances or shades?
I tend to agree with Arvind. I mean, it's actually a healthy situation here. It will give confidence to the bankers as well, because the equity is already there and there won't be immediate exit, if you see. And also, as Debasish was saying, these are the only two principles: 26% equity and 51% minimum consumption. Whatever you changed, even 1% of that, if you change, then you are not following in spirit and letter. So earlier, whatever they on these projects on a thinly capitalized or a loosely worded group captive structure, I think those are all will be now gone, and the pure captive or a real group captive will be coming in. I think this is really helpful, especially for the MNCs, where they don't want to get caught in the auditing and then say you're not following in spirit and letter. So that will get avoided now. And actually gives a lot of confidence to the bankers, I would say.
Okay. So here is a question for all of you. The open access wind and solar combined capacity in our estimate is less than 1,000 megawatts per annum. Of course, 2018 was a breakaway year because of Karnataka, but since then the market has stagnated, as we also saw in one of the slides. Given the current policy scenario and the various changes and the financial condition of the discoms, how positive are you, or what is your prognosis about the total growth of the market over the next 5 years? I'll throw it open. We can take it in turns. Anybody who wants to go first.
I think the challenge for Discom Financial will itself be the fastest driver for CNI market, because whether you sell directly to Discoms or you use SECI as an intermediary, ultimately the credit risk is the same. It will come to haunt you. If you sell to a bankrupt customer through a trader, the credit of the customer will finally come to haunt you. And I think until that is solved, my view is that CNI business will be driven until the Discom financial situation is sorted out. And the changes in the proposed Amendment Act are actually far-reaching, extremely well thought out in my view. If those actually get enacted, the change will not come overnight, but the Discom financial health will, in my opinion, improve over the next 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
But
So, any number for what we could see by way of capacity addition over the next 5 years? Any rough guesses?
I would budget a 30 to 40% growth a year, based on the fact that more and more consumers are driven to renewable energy because of sustainability needs. As Bhavna presented earlier, if you see that chart, more than half the consumers are buying renewable energy because of business strategy, not because of regulatory pressure or incentives. And I think so that will drive faster adoption. The renewable energy is supplied by the consumers, and at the generators and developers end, the improvement in technology, whether it is through hybridization or through better value addition through sharper forecasting and scheduling to the consumers, all of these things will continue to drive this change.
Okay. So we have finally we have Dinesh with us. Dinesh, good afternoon. Thank you for taking the time. I'm not sure if you heard any of the comments before you joined, but let me just summarize very quickly in 2 or 3 minutes, so that you can comment on that and offer the MNRE perspective. By and large, the situation is that both the consumers and the developers are very, very keen to enable fast growth of this market. We actually see a flood of customers who are saying that they want to go to 100% RE over the next 3, 5, or 10 years. In contrast, the position is that we estimate that the actual direct consumption of RE by CNI consumers is less than 5% today. So that 5% can potentially go to 50% or more, and that is a huge growth opportunity for the renewable sector. But what is happening on the ground is actually pretty disappointing, in the sense that the Discoms and the state regulators are not keen for the CNI consumers to go away. So the policy landscape is becoming more challenging. Whether it is the group captive policy, whether it is the charges, or whether it is the banking provisions, etc. So the question really is, how can we tap into this abundant growth opportunity? And we have these 3 large, well-capitalized investors who are basically saying that we don't have enough opportunities. So how can MNRE support the growth of this market and get the states to align, basically?
Yeah. Thank you, Vinay, and good afternoon to all of you. My apologies for not able to catch you guys right from the beginning, but I missed the entire discussion that I was really keen to eager. And as I just joined, Arvind said that there has been some positive steps. So I just joined on when I should actually joined. So nevertheless, I am a firm believer myself, and my personal views always go with that. And I have been on the other side, taking advantage of the open access as a stream of selling renewable energy to the consumers who would need and who are very willing to go green. And as you rightly said, Vinay, there has been an attempt, and there has been some successful attempts in reaching a reasonably level of RE penetration into their electricity mix of those large consumers, which everybody is aware of. But the intent from MNRE, as we were also discussing a few days back, MNRE is really keen to see how can we facilitate this particular resource or this particular way of penetrating into the energy mix of the country. We have seen the growth, which today may be at 88 gigawatts, and we have a visibility of another 70-80 gigawatts in terms of the tendering at various stages. While the attempt is to reach that 175 gigawatt targets, but obviously there are several restraints and constraints, which starts from, and majorly it comes from the DISCOM as an entity, which actually buys the power and then distributes it within the state. So that federal mechanism of concurrency in the country exists, and within that framework, the amendment that has been proposed by the Ministry of Power is an extremely aggressive step in terms of reforms that we need to penetrate and open the open access sector. And majorly what we identify, and while we also at MNRE were trying to identify what are the barriers to really promote open access, and prominently it comes as tariff design and rationalization. These are the feedbacks that we got during our recent conversations, and some reports are also being in the public domain. Tariff design and rationalization is one of them, and cross subsidy surcharge, as we are all aware, additional surcharge over and above that. And from the DISCOM side, I think it is the frequent switching by open access consumers. When we are hearing most of the DISCOMs, this particular aspect does come on their very predominant list of that the problems they face, and whereas then in other element of standby charges. So these are 5-6 barriers from both ends, from the consumer end as well as from the DISCOM end, which are being really reviewed. From Ministry of Power perspective, they are really looking at what can be done to really promote open access. Even the benchmark figure of 1 MVA as the minimum capacity to allow penetration has been also being looked at. It has been also looked at how the cross subsidy surcharge for the green energy can be really softened, or is there any way out. But of course, the Electricity Act, once it comes into the amendment, once it comes into force, there can be some mechanism which will ease out and reduce the trajectory with the predetermined numbers, and most of the states or all the states would have to follow that. We at MNRE have been in touch with, we do our own exercise with the states, and we have SECI, and including the Ministry of New, and our own members are trying to get in touch with several states. Obviously, the so-called barrier, which we all know is on the tariffs that have reduced substantially. So while we speak with the DISCOMs, and then there is a viability issue, then they talk about the
We're not able to hear you.
Yeah, I think we all lost him.
Yeah, sorry, we lost you.
Dinesh ji, I don't know if you can hear me. We cannot hear you.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you now. Yes.
Oh, sorry. I just thought I was not audible. See, basically, we have made both the intrastate, interstate open access charges. We have mapped all the states. We have looked at what kind of revenue realization or what kind of cost of open access power at the generators bus is being derived at. So there is some kind of possibility that from a commercial perspective, it's still not that very bad. It's not into red. There is some kind of leverage that the business still makes sense. What we'll have to work on more is on the institutionalization of the process, making open access as an acceptable part of the DISCOMs, and so that there is no barrier. Making open access more, ease of doing, for example, ease of doing business in terms of having a clear-cut mandatory provision to get the open access approval within the predetermined period. Even though some of the activities I mentioned are there in the act, in the proposed act as well, but we find that is not followed in the entire, in totality. And therefore, some kind of guiding principles and orders are being reviewed and looked at, so that all states do not, once an application is received, there is a predetermined period by which the open access approval is supposed to be given, and it will be given, and therefore these are some of the one is that. Second is about exorbitant charges or exorbitant charges that the discoms are levying. We are really talking to most of the discoms, and I think if you really look at Maharashtra, Karnataka, Andhra, Tamil Nadu, which have been predominantly favoring or being open access friendly states, they have been promoting these states. Of late, we find Madhya Pradesh also, Gujarat, but obviously as the penetrating increases, as the rate came down and the optimized tariffs came below in the range of 250 to 70, there is when I think there was a more thought process more from the discom side in terms of discouraging open access. While I say that, one thing I can assure you is that open access to the ministry is taken very seriously. Even as I speak, I come from a meeting where this topic was also discussed. Very soon, certain friendly regulations. No, I cannot tell it as a regulation, but some of directives can be looked at from the Ministry of Power to ease out the regulatory procedures for seeking open access regulations. More things need to be done. Primarily, it's more about the Electricity Act amendment that has to go through. So the entire process is driven by that, and we hope that once it is done, the entire market will open. 100% RE is also some kind of discussion that we need to really look at. And I missed your topics, and I would really like the developers and the investors here in this forum to really send us some recommendations that you feel how this can be achieved. What are your recommendations that we should really work on to make wind, especially the renewable energy part, open access, looking at the uncertainty, looking at the banking provisions, how can we really encourage industries to move towards maximum RE penetration as close to as 100% as some of the countries, as Vinay was mentioning, are allowing that particular penetration. So I'm very keen to understand that. We are open to suggestions. In the regulatory domain of MNRE, there is a little, we don't have much control on the entire process from a MNRE perspective, but our effort is to really persuade states and the Ministry of Power to look at these very rigorously and bring in a kind of change that will then allow all of us to look at captive, look at group captive, look at third-party sales, open access, and RE power. So I think in the near future to come, we will have some really good brainstorming, and maybe Vinay, you can share me the outcome of the discussions, and we will like to deliberate in this within our forums so as to take it forward. So that was my initial. Thank you, Vinay, again, and thank you all for listening me. Not much to really give you at this stage, but I can say that we are really working on to make this happen. So open to ideas and suggestions from all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dinesh. I think that must be music to the ears of everybody who's present in the webinar. I'm very happy to, if any of the panelists want to ask or pose any questions to Mr. Jagdale, please feel free to do so now.
Vinay, this is Mani here. You can ask a question.
Yeah, please.
So, Mr. Jagdale, you mentioned about certain friendly directives from the Ministry of Power to be sort of to ease out the process of open access. Can you give us some color on what form or shape it would take, and how it would ensure that the implementation on the ground will take place at the state level?
Mani, I think these are at the drawing board. These are being discussed within the ministries. I will not be able to share you much on this today, but very soon some kind of directives will come. This will be more on the process. How the process has to look at how do we encourage more and more RE usage within the open access framework. So that is what I have been told, and as soon as we get something, obviously it will be shared with you all.
Thank you. Vinay, I have two follow-up questions, if I can ask Vinay. One is in terms of bilateral sale of green attributes or exchange, REC related sort of green attributes to customers on a bilateral basis rather than through the exchange. Is there any thought process for bringing that in place today that is not allowed? I was wondering if is that something that is going to be possible going forward in the future?
This particular bilateral issue does come up for discussions, but as you know, today the regulatory mechanism doesn't allow that. So nothing much has been progressed on that. So we haven't progressed much to really say something, but it does come up for discussions, and hopefully we see some discussions going forward in the future.
Also, the third point was more to do with contract for differences. Is that something that can be now made applicable as by law available to customers to enter into such contracts with developers? Because today that is not possible under the current law.
I really need to. I will not be able to tell you more on this. I also need to get some feedback. Thank you.
I think, Manikkan, what we can do is, if everybody's game, we can make a small list of suggestions or questions for Mr. Jagdale and share with him in a written form.
Yeah.
Sure.
That would be nice.
With your permission, if I can just raise one suggestion to Mr. Jagdale at this time.
Yes, Arvind, please.
Vinay, I'll go next after that.
Dinesh,
how are you, Arvind? All well? Your video is not very clear.
Okay, I'm seeing you after a very long time in person and in video. You have been an arts all well in Mumbai, as well as it can be in current circumstances.
Thank
you.
So
it's good. One suggestion, one of the common question that was raised during this panel was that different states have different interpretation of open access regulations, particularly the group captive definitions and criteria available for group captive, and that is pending in different judicial forums. One suggestion to bring commonality to and a common conclusion to all of this, since MNRE/MOP is the architect or the architect of those rules, can MNRE or MOP look at embedding itself in those cases and providing its view as a view of the legislature to the courts, so that common decisions can come out of these regulatory forums, and one can put an end to this ongoing litigation in multiple forums by different people.
Valid point. I think I had been briefly touched this point with my colleague in MOP, and even showed the earlier draft which was there. I will again have a word with him. It is necessary that this clarifications needs to be there. But you mentioned something about the various the states coming out with their own versions of understanding the procedure and the provisions. So maybe you can share me which states and particularly what type of option is there. I will definitely have a word with my counterpart JS in the Ministry of Power. I will follow up on that.
Thank you very much. That will be very useful. We'll send it to you.
Yeah.
Bhavna?
Good afternoon, Mr. Jagdale. Very helpful and very positive to hear about the kind of receptivity you have, and it's very positive because that's something that we have seen in the past couple of years. In fact, and we've recently launched a report, and in fact last year we launched a report specifically summarizing some of the issues that C&I consumers were facing. Particularly from a policy and regulatory perspective, whether it was inconsistencies or other issues related to policy implementation, of course, which we have already highlighted in terms of uncertainty or inconsistency or gaps in implementation. So those are all collated in our report. We are happy to share that. We've also been exploring what are the various models of RE procurement for different mechanisms. So not just open access. Open access, of course, is a major part, and that is addressed in some of the policy and regulatory concerns that some of the C&I consumers were facing, but also looking at alternative models such as green tariffs through discoms, buying renewables through discoms, or virtual power purchase agreements or national renewable energy credits. dedicated peer RE exchanges, or looking at peer-to-peer trading. So different models, and we were exploring some of the international models that have worked in different countries, and sort of explored them from an India perspective. And this is something that we took help from Bridge to India as well. This is where we partnered with them on exploring some of these models on open access and these models. So we are happy to share and bring that to you. I mean, we've had some discussions with different people like Dr. Methani and also the former secretary in the past through CII also. So these are conversations that have been ongoing, and some of the CNI consumers have already made these sort of presentations to MNRE before as well on these very issues. We are happy to.
Bhavna, yes, I think we will be happy to. I think instead of the entire report, let's now address one by one as an issue. For example, let's take open access as a subject and get a complete. We know the barriers today. We will try to see what best can we do, how best can we integrate within the framework of the regulatory mechanism that we have today, and see if something can be done. I know it will be more coming from a directives from the government and asking states, but as you rightly we all are aware, states have the final say, and therefore it is necessary that we communicate with states, talk to them and see the benefits. So one is that, and the other markets mechanisms that you talked about, primarily for an RE perspective and to reach our massive targets, which we intend to do, we need to have all mechanisms in place. And I keep on saying we have to have all technologies, we'll have to have all mechanisms of selling, creating market mechanisms which will stand on its own and have a commercially tangible benefits to the investor who is investing. So we want to make that as the theme of our growth story of India, and therefore not only open access, but you talked about exchange, you talked of peer-to-peer, and you see some of the exchanges right now which got opened in July, the mechanism which got opened in July. I think it will also move towards that. So the intent is very clear, and Honorable Minister always talks about making RE rich or making more and more penetration available in the RE states. So we are talking about RE plus storage, we're talking of RE 24/7, RE green, all those business models are coming, and therefore this mechanism of buying or making an industry 100% RE through whatever means we will now derive is going to come, and that's for sure. It's just about tweaking and making the regulatory framework making it acceptable within whatever we have. So happy to really discuss and receive all your suggestions and remarks, but let's focus one aspect and then let's get it done. Thank you.
Sure, very positive. Thank you very much. We'll certainly do that.
Thank you, Mr. Jagdale. I think we're nearly out of time, so we are happy to facilitate this process in any way. If you want to share your questions or comments with MNRE, please let us know if we can kind of play a role there. So, I would just like to summarize and close the discussion. I think overall there is obviously a lot of optimism about open access. We discussed how open access and, more specifically, widely speaking, CNI renewables is the key to growing the renewable sector in India. There are various challenges, but at the same time, we have to appreciate what the DISCOM financial conditions is. And we can't wish those concerns away. I think we have to find long-term solutions together with DISCOMs, state regulators, and MNRE. And I think the only other thing I would say is that, overall, on the private side, there is, whether it is investors, financiers, or consumers, there is a huge amount of interest, and there is an opportunity for India to kind of support this market. So with that, I would like to thank all of you, all the speakers, all the panelists, and most importantly, Mr. Jagdale, for taking the time. All the audience, we've had fantastic response. We had about 900 registrations and more than 470 people present on the webinar. So it's fantastic to have you all. I think we've all benefited from your comments and insights. There will be a video recording of the webinar available on our website. I will just ask my colleague Sangeeta to share the details with you. So once again, thank you so much, and I'll pass over to Sangeeta now.
Thank you, Vinay, and thank you, panelists and the speakers, especially Mr. Jagdale, for being part of today's webinar. As Vinay said, we will be sharing a recording of the proceedings today with all of you on your registered email ID. And our next webinar is the residential rooftop solar ready to take off, and it will be held in the last week of October. So until then, goodbye from us, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.